Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Halliday of the Grace Richardson Fund. Thank you all for being here. Some of our conference participants are having a little trouble getting here, just going through security and finish up their other speaking engagements. So I'm just going to do a few introductory remarks, and then we'll start the program when a greater number of panelists and participants have arrived. The Grace Richardson Fund was started a number of years ago. It had a healthcare focus. In 2016, we shifted our focus to participate mostly on climate change, and we focus on free market principles, trying to bring some of those market mechanisms into the floor and into the broader climate change discussion. Over the last few weeks, we've had a couple of changes in the schedule that we've put forward on the official schedule at the UNFCCC. I'd just like to go over who some of the participants are now, and those that are here will be able to continue their discussion and give introductory remarks and participate in the roundtable. And I'll be happy to answer any questions of anyone once we get started and after I sit down. This panel will be led by Rod Richardson. He's president of the Grace Richardson Fund and co-founder of the Climate and Freedom International Coalition. Lord Syed Kamal, member of the House of Lords and Parliament in United Kingdom and professor of international relations, St. Mary's University, and an academic fellow for the Institute for Economic Affairs in the United Kingdom. Senator Mohamed Farid, who's just joining us right now. He's a member, yes, he's a member of the Egyptian Senate and founder of the Cairo Liberal Club. Coming a bit later, we have a few members from the Australian delegation. I'll say them, they might arrive. Councillor Oldrich Vlasak from Hradec Kralove, the Czech Republic. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, sir. He's a member of the European Conservatives and Reformists and Committee of the Regions in the European Union. Dr. Michael Mealing, Deputy Director of MIT CEPR and Professor of Practice, University of Strathclyde School of Law in Scotland, United Kingdom. Landon Darrance, a member of the Atlantic Council, was not able to join us today. We're certainly sorry about that. Dr. Sajiv Nair, board member and regional director of CUTS International. It's based in Geneva, but it has a number of sites worldwide, and he is based in Africa. And Dr. Vaibhav Chaturvedi, he's a fellow for the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water. He is also a little delayed with a conflicting speaking engagement. He'll be along shortly, or he might send a representative to speak on his behalf. Rod Richardson has just arrived. Welcome, everyone. So I believe that we have enough to begin the discussion. I imagine that we'll start with some introductory remarks and open it up to discussion and perhaps be able to have questions at the floor. When other people come in, perhaps at the midpoint of the event, we'll do a changeover or people will be able to give remarks at this location. Thanks again for joining us. You can see us on our website, gracerichardsonfund.org, and I'll be posting information about this event and other activities we do in the near future. Enjoy COP. Thanks very much for joining us today. Good day.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you all for coming today. Thank you for all the speakers for coming, and we have a few members of the Australian delegation who will be joining us. They're coming a little late. I apologize for being late. My cab driver got completely lost on the way, so that was fun. A chance to get some exercise. But in any event, so today we will be discussing the question of what are the potential frameworks for an international free market climate agreement. And to set this up, I think we need to discuss why this is an important topic to discuss. Yesterday, some members of our panel, Lord Kamal and Senator Farid and I, and a few, Michael Mealing and a few other folks, joined us for a discussion on EU versus US policy, looking at the pros and cons of those policies. And, to sum up that discussion, I would say that, the pros of EU policy are that the Europeans tried to do what they thought was rational, using market mechanisms, using carbon pricing, which at the time they put those mechanisms in place, they thought that that would be the simplest, most direct way to do it. But it has turned out that what they thought was going to be simple and easy has turned out to be fairly complicated and to have lots of unintended consequences that were not anticipated by the original advocates of those ideas. So, for instance, the main mechanism that the EU has pursued has been the ETS, and yet, the original, proponents of that idea thought that that would solve the problem of climate change in Europe and shift things over, but we find now that that has led to uncompetitiveness in European industry. We find that it has led to offshoring of carbon-intensive manufacturing and the exporting of emissions to other countries, and then re-importing them through products. We find that it has led to a sort of a politicization of how offsets are handed out, how those various carbon credits are allocated. And then, because of this problem of uncompetitiveness and carbon leakage, you now have a demand for a very complicated mechanism, which is not simple, called the CBAM, to try to fix that. So, arguably, there perhaps is no admission of policy failure greater than the CBAM, because, basically Europe is saying, we have to do this to globalize, climate change action, because we've made ourselves uncompetitive and we now have carbon leakage. We've shot ourselves in our own foot, and now our solution is to shoot everyone else in the foot. So there is a basic problem with that. By contrast, the United States has done, on the plus side, instead of using, well, I think if you want to sum up the cons on the EU side, how many people here went to school and went to a school where they were beaten if they got something wrong? Anyone? No, I don't think so. I think the UK was the last country to phase out beating kids in schools, and that was 10 years ago. So I don't think anybody does it anymore. Most people realize that if you beat students, it's not a good idea. So punitive policies that impose punishments on people actually have blowback. And one of those blowbacks is people exit. They leave you. So you end up having uncompetitive firms, and you end up having, your industries leave. So on the plus side, the United States has largely through the IRA used positive incentives, which does lead to people coming in the door if you have positive incentives, and you have, folks coming in the door. But at the same time, the United States has made its own set of mistakes, perhaps with over-subsidization and using the wrong kinds of positive incentives. So the United States has seen by its recent forays into industrial policies have been accompanied by strong inflation, and the inflation has raised the interest rates that make it very difficult to finance renewable energy projects. So you have blowback in that way. You also see supply chain problems from perhaps also from over-subsidization, so that you see the costs of materials through the trade policies of the United States have been steadily rising and making these projects more expensive. So that there have been mistakes on both sides, and then the kinds of tax credits that are being used were a policy instrument basically that were invented at a time when you had most clean technologies, going back to the 1990s and early 2000s, were not really profitable and competitive. So you needed to use something like a tax credit mechanism to make these things viable. But now we're talking about industries that are actually profitable in the best sited locations that can stand on their own feet without subsidies. And so, I think there's one thing that was mentioned by Nick Loris on our panel was there's an R Street report that shows that 2/3 of the projects that are financed by the IRA would have been built anyway. So, that is simply a wealth transfer that didn't need to happen. That's basically subsidy leakage. So, is there a better way to push these projects forward, in a healthier way? So the question of free market climate policy, and by the way, I don't mean anarcho-capitalism or crony capitalism or anything like that. We're talking about policies, here that are removing barriers from harmless, beneficial innovators, is what is understood by free market policy. Removing barriers rather than imposing barriers. So the Grace Richardson Fund is a private foundation. I am the president of that, and we have been, on a mission since around 2014, 2015, going public with it in 2016 to pioneer free market approaches to climate policy. And we've done that largely through collaborative policy innovation work, where we pull together groups of scholars, think tanks, industry experts, legal experts, et cetera, to think about, what would be how the question of how you use free market policy to accelerate decarbonization wasn't necessarily immediately obvious. We thought that there was a good argument for it because by 2015, you saw many clean technologies actually becoming profitable and competitive. So it seemed to be that, if you saw technologies moving from unprofitable to profitable and competitive, it meant that the policy paradigm had to change, and you could use free market policies. For instance, if something can compete, arguably the most important policy that you can do, that you can have, is to let it compete, to open the market so that it can get in there and spread, so that you can spread innovation within your nation and internationally. So internal competition and free trade internationally would become important decarbonizing policies, we argued, if you looked at this. And indeed, that hypothesis has been borne out. There's a very good study by Wayne Weingarten from the Pacific Research Institute, who did a study comparing the competitive versus the uncompetitive power markets in the United States, showing that the competitive power markets are decarbonizing 66% faster than the uncompetitive power markets, than the monopoly markets, right? And there's a reason for that. A competitive market allows you to have your starry-eyed entrepreneurs and innovators come in easily, without as many barriers that they have to jump through. The connection times in the competitive markets, are much faster. The time to hook up a new project is a fraction of the time in Texas than it is in some of the monopoly markets, because the rules in a competitive market are geared towards getting the new generation in. Consumers in a fully competitive market can actually demand cleaner energy. They can ask for cleaner products. So all of those forces in a competitive market actually drive decarbonization. The same is true with free trade. I hope Michael Mealing will tell us a little bit about the history of the development of solar panels, which relied entirely on free trade as a development mechanism, and the importance of that. But you can even look at things like how the the Japanese automobile makers in the 1970s and the 1980s, before anyone really knew about climate change, were able to help decarbonize the US and the European automobile industry because of free trade and market access and the ability to compete with a better, more efficient product. So these policy paradigms seem to be important. Another thing that seemed to be the case is that once you have profitable firms, right, in a market, you no longer need to use the same kind of subsidy tools where you're basically robbing Peter to pay Paul. That doesn't make any sense when you have profits. When you have profits, you can use traditional pro-growth style supply-side tax policy to promote decarbonization. And there's a couple of ways to do that, which I will get into as I explain this. But what and all of these ideas were developed. We actually went through this process of these collaborative working groups that are called charrettes. It's a tool from architecture where it's a kind of design meeting where you get all the experts together to design policy. It's a particular kind of format. And we looked at things like, how do you decarbonize the oil and gas sector? How do you decarbonize the power markets? How do you decarbonize farming, forestry? How do you decarbonize industry, real estate? How do you use supply-side tax cuts in these areas? How do you integrate that with competition, with free trade? So that work has taken several years, and this year has been an interesting year for us because we have been able to convince a lot of the most free markety of free markety think tanks that there really is a free market pathway to decarbonization. So right now I am co-hosting something called the Climate and Freedom International Coalition with the Tholos Foundation, which is the nonprofit arm of Americans for Tax Reform. Americans for Tax Reform is, if anybody knows who they are, Grover Norquist, the name might ring a bell. They are a organization that's known for being very much pro-free market policies, pro-low taxes, and they're very good at running coalition meetings. They have their own meeting in Washington on Wednesdays, and they have helped stand up coalition meetings around the world on trade and other issues. The Climate and Freedom International Coalition is one that they're partnering on now because they think it's important to facilitate a conversation on free market approaches to climate. And, they have brought in, well, not them, but the coalition meeting has brought together many, many free market groups. And this April, at a conference at two conferences actually in Portugal, a week apart, free market conferences where it was exclusively free market think tanks, we floated a proposal on this question of what should a free market international climate agreement look like. And we floated a straw proposal called the Climate and Freedom Accord. If you point your camera at that QR code, it will take you to a copy of the original proposal considered by the free market think tanks. And you will note that the language there is language that a free market-oriented think tank would be comfortable with. We don't talk about market mechanisms. We talk straight up about free markets. So it is geared towards the way a free market think tank would think about these things. And so that straw proposal was the basis for discussion. And, it has actually, those think tanks changed some of the ideas in that proposal, because, we don't, tell people who come to our collaborative policy innovation events how to think. We might give them a few ideas to start the discussion, but frequently those ideas change in the process of discussion. And if any of you feel inspired to join our coalitions, we don't demand that anybody follow our ideas precisely, and people do go off in their own directions and take these ideas in other ways. But those ideas have inspired about 9 different think tanks across Europe to start their own studies on opening up markets using the ideas in this. The Institute for Free Trade in London, led by Lord Hannan, who's in the House of Lords, is doing one such study. There is the Warsaw Enterprise Institute in Poland that's leading a group of 7 think tanks in Eastern and Central Europe on opening up markets there. Juan de Mariannette Institute in Spain is leading another group of think tanks in Southern Europe and North Africa. And we anticipate more studies to come in the Middle East, perhaps led by Senator Farid and at his Cairo Liberal Club, and also in Latin America and North Africa and elsewhere. So what is this climate and freedom proposal, and what does it look like? Essentially, from the free market perspective, as I mentioned, competition and free trade are essential to decarbonization. But from a 30,000-foot perspective, you have to understand that there is no such thing as a national climate policy. And the reason is because, anything that one nation might do doesn't make any difference unless the rest of the world is somehow involved. And that's the motivation, I think, of the European CBAM, is to get other nations involved. However, it's questionable whether, the negative approach of beating students, shall we say, or punishment mechanism is going to get people in the door in the right way. We have thought about ways to flip the script and use positive incentives. And what does this look like? How do you internationalize competition and free trade as essential tools for decarbonization and point it in the same way? Well, the way to do that, the Climate and Freedom Accord suggests, is using a capital accelerator mechanism tied to a agreement that promotes free trade and competition. And the capital accelerator mechanism, there are actually, the agreement proposes 2 kinds of basic kinds of clean tax cuts. There are actually more than 2 kinds, but the 2 basic kinds are important to understand. One is completely technology neutral, and the other is technology neutral but pointed at a metric of decarbonization. Both, however, tend to promote decarbonization. So starting with the equity side clean tax cuts, to understand how these work and why they might be better than traditional subsidies, is, you are essentially, these clean tax cuts work in 4 basic industrial sectors that are responsible for 80% of global carbon emissions. Those sectors are transportation, industry, electricity and power, and real estate. Those are the 4 big ones. Those sectors, you can easily use clean tax cuts in them in the following way. This is very easy to understand in the automobile industry. The sustainability of products in the automobile industry can be reduced to one number: the average vehicle fleet emissions. So the lower the emissions, the cleaner their fleet, right, in terms of carbon emissions. The lower that number, the lower the tax rate on business and investor income. And you're not talking about replacing basic pro-growth supply-side tax cuts. What you're talking about doing is adding a bonus layer of tax reduction on top of, beyond what otherwise, is available. So the highest performing companies that go beyond the basic requirements for emissions reductions would be rewarded with, say, an extra 5 points of, tax rate reduction. And there would be a sliding scale for people coming in 2nd, 3rd, and 4th place, right? So in addition to that, you can do the same kind of basic idea across the transportation sector. You can do the same thing in the electricity sector with the sale of zero-emission electricity. You could do the same in industry, targeting the production of energy-efficient home appliances and industrial equipment. You could do the same in the oil and gas sector for reducing fugitive hydrocarbon emissions at the wellhead or in the production process, in the transportation of fuels and in the refinement of them. You could do the same in the real estate sector, targeting the taxes that landlords and real estate investors pay on the construction and renovation of more energy-efficient buildings. So these four sectors, 80% of global emissions, and all of those also feed into the agriculture sector. So agriculture uses transportation, it uses electricity, et cetera. So you end up pretty much hitting the entire economy when you do that with a steering mechanism towards decarbonization. And if you think about that framework for just a second, compared to, say, a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, instead of piling on costs and taxes on your economy, you're reducing taxes, right? So instead of people running for the exits, people are coming into your economy. People are coming in. It's a positive incentive, so you have the advantage of having stronger companies. If you think about two countries side by side, one using punitive carbon pricing, one using what is essentially positive reward-based, a carbon tax cut, which economy is going to be stronger? It's going to be the one where the burdens on those companies are less. They're rewarded for decarbonization rather than punished. So but that is maybe not the most powerful of the clean tax cut tools. When we were involved in the charrette process, a professor at Columbia named Travis Bradford said to me, Rod, I know you're a supply sider, and it's true that there are great ways to decarbonize the automobile industry, the electric power industry, et cetera, using on the equity side, but that's expensive, and it's maybe not as powerful as if you apply your supply side tax cut to the supply of capital itself. When a capitalist needs to buy capital equipment, they go to the capital markets. The capital markets are the debt markets where you finance, they use debt rather than equity because debt is cheaper. That's financial leverage. If you use cheap debt, that actually raises your equity price because you're getting cheaper financing and you're improving your firm's performance by getting the cheaper financing. So this is if you were to, what Travis suggested was if you were to provide tax-exempt debt for capital investment, for property, plant, and equipment, essentially what you would be doing is making the cost of property, plant, and equipment cheaper. 30% cheaper in many advanced countries, or even more depending on the prevailing tax rates. So, at least on the debt side. So that itself, that phenomenon of making investment cheaper has been studied through looking at concepts like full expensing and accelerated depreciation, which do the same thing. They make equipment cheaper, because if you make the investment cheaper, essentially what you do is you create you make energy efficient investments cheaper. And there's very good studies that show that accelerated depreciation, even back in 1981, before anyone knew about climate change, helped fuel the initial energy efficiency revolution in the 1980s. In addition, you see that if you incentivize the investment in new equipment is always cleaner, more efficient than the old equipment. So you're accelerating the process of energy transition, and you're doing so in a technology-neutral way across all technologies. You can use this mechanism, in addition, as an incentive in an international agreement. You can actually make this an international supply-side tax cut rather than just a national supply-side tax cut, because you can use tax reciprocity in an agreement. So the way it would work is that if you sign up for an agreement where you're opening up your market to competition, to access, so that innovation can spread rapidly, so that people can get energy access, so that people can hook up to the grid faster and you can build out grid for everybody faster. Then you also get a capital acceleration mechanism that comes with that agreement. So developers, banks, mutual funds would be able to raise any kind of tax-exempt debt in any of the nations that are associated with this agreement. And that could be in any form. It could be bonds, loans, savings accounts. So anybody could participate. Every citizen who even has can afford a bank account can participate. This is highly participatory, as opposed to, say, the tax credits in the IRA, which only, say, the Berkshire Hathaways of the world can take full advantage of. And everybody else has to use tax equity trading. And if you're a small entrepreneur doing smaller than $20 million projects, they don't even want to talk to you. But this is a highly participatory framework where you can raise these funds and they can be invested in property, plant, and equipment across all the nations that are participating in such an agreement. So you're spreading innovation, low carbon innovation at the same time rapidly everywhere. So this is a alternative to, say, the CBAM, because it's another way for spreading decarbonization around the world, but without punishing people, without hurting your friends. Part of the problem with the CBAM is that it really hurts the economies of friendly nations. That, nations who would be the friends of Europe are now less than thrilled that they are being subjected to what they consider to be climate imperialism and the overreachings of what they call a regulatory superpower. So this is an alternative framework, the Climate and Freedom Accord. And with that, Sure. With that, I wanted to, turn this discussion over to, I think, Mohamed Farid next, and to describe your experience in Egypt. You are deal a lot with Europe. What do you think about the European regulatory framework, and have you thought about alternatives?
Thank you. Well, thank you, Rod. It's really interesting and thrilling to be here. To continue the discussion that we were having yesterday, because yesterday we was talking extensively about the CBAM and so on. And let's start by that. Before 2004, Egypt and the EU didn't have this framework of free trade. And in 2004 till 2023, in 20 years, the amount of bilateral trade had tripled. This is the power of free trade. This is what you can get when you have free flow of goods and services between the two sides of the Mediterranean, per se. This is not just numbers. This means improvement in people's lives. This means more prosperity being created. This means more opportunity being created. Right now, with the implementation of CBAM, we see the opposite of that. Why we see the opposite of that? With the current 6 sectors that are proposed in the current CBAM, this represents 10% of Egypt exports to the EU, which is responsible for about 0.3% of the GDP of Egypt. Nonetheless, what is really concerning that in 2025, there will be a review for the CBAM and might be expanded to other products, which means that will be more curbing in that field. So this is from one side. The other side, looking at the emissions, and I'm sorry if I'll be cynical here, I'm really sorry, but the entire emissions come out of Africa is about 3.4, 3.9 to the global. And if you look at the different estimates of the livestock emissions, you'd find it's like 4 or 5 times more than what Africa emits. So this is a simple thing, you know. You do that and you let other countries that do a lot of emission, you know, and do a lot of harm without any help. They think that the Europeans say that, yeah, we would like to level the playing field, but this is not actually the case. You are distorting the case in that manner, because over the decades, over the years, the free trade had helped people to move forward, to have better lives, to be improved. And when we're here at the COP talking about the climate change and the climate action, and how can we prevent that, and how we move against this existential threat which affects all of us, we talk about the just transition, and the just transition I believe it should be as simple as that. It should be creating prosperity, opportunity for everyone, not just for someone and others not. The final thing that when you set your goals, that's very good. Everybody would like to see the action going faster and faster and more rapid, but when you set it unilaterally and you abide the others to follow it, you are not helping anyone. You have to be realistic when you're tackling such an existential problem. You have to create more inclusive framework to be able to decide what could help the entire population of this planet. How can you unlock the potential for innovation? How can you incentivize new solutions? How can you create competitiveness? Because simply the competitiveness which leads us here today to be able here to benefit from every perspective of the technology here. So this is the case. So we have to put this in our mind. With regard to the accord that we're talking about today, I personally started to work on the clean tax cut in the Egyptian Senate. I introduced that initially in a national discussion in the Egyptian Senate with regard that we need to do more tax cuts in order to be able to be more attractive for innovation, and not just for innovation, I mean not in national sector, but widely. Energy efficiency is a major thing. It's an important thing. And if you can incentivize different corporates, different companies to be more energy efficient, that would be very good by creating some tax incentives. Creating incentives for different industries, allowing companies to be able to have lower cost of capital, so they can what's called expand their work and move forward for that. So this is from our side. We see that the CBAM is making more harm than benefit, and actually it's not. If we'd like to go in that direction, and if I'd like to set goals, it has to be multilateral, not unilateral. We have to talk to different parties. We need to look at the standardization. Who do the standardization? That thing, when you design a policy, it has to be simple and streamline the process. It's very difficult, to have such a very extremely complicated policy which goes with a lot of steps of reporting and reviewing and issuing a lot of things. This means a lot of cost also incurred in this policy, and this gives you more possibility of lack of implementation. I guess I'm among a lot of politicians and policymakers, and we know very well, if you'd like to have an efficient policy that is applicable and it can get results done, you have to simplify it. And the CBAM is extremely complicated. I mean, sorry for saying that, but I even talked to some consultants firm, and no, we don't get it clearly. We don't understand that. And even with discussion with the Europeans in Egypt, about that before October, before the reviewing period, what's going to happen, what we're going to do, are the institutions ready? And no one is ready, simply because you set higher goals than your capability to move forward. So again, the climate crisis, and I'm calling it climate crisis, it's an existential crisis. It's something that affects every and each one of us all over the world, and that we need realistic approach for that, and we need to move forward in that manner collectively and with clear understanding of how we can create benefits for everyone, and how can we benefit from that, and how can we enhance competition? How can we assure innovation is there, not to put barriers, but to lower the barriers and create prosperity and opportunity for everyone? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Farid. I feel your pain over the CBAM. You know, the thing that's remarkable about the CBAM is that even if you're if you're doing everything right, and you're a firm that is reducing your carbon emissions, your costs are massively increased because of the reporting requirements. You know, there are, you know, the CBAM really requires sustainability accountants, and there simply aren't enough people who are trained as sustainability accountants throughout the world to do the reporting that's required by the CBAM framework. You know, so I think that you're running into a real problem with how are you really even going to, how are firms going to comply with this when, you know, the complexities of supply chain accounting are so difficult that, you know, it's you know, hard to imagine how this is going to occur. So if we could move to Lord Kamal. Lord Kamal, you have been thinking about sustainability issues for a long time, first as a member of the European Parliament and then now in the House of Lords in the UK. What do you think of, you know, the concept of a international free market climate agreement, of the proposal, and, you know, what would you, what are your top thoughts on this subject?
Sure. So I should also, thank you very much for inviting me here, and I should also give some an aspect or a perception as well from the angle of international politics, because you can't do, you can't ignore the international political economy angle of this. But in domestic politics, what we've got to understand is you've got some potential to push something like what you're asking for, because sadly for many voters, when they look at green policies, they see the green taxes, but they don't see the corresponding tax cut for the cleaner technology. And therefore, for many consumers, they just see green taxes as more expense for them. You know, they have to buy an EV car, or they can't drive in certain places, and things like that. And therefore, you know, to get people on side, you have to make sure there's a corresponding offset. But of course, quite often, the money that's raised does not goes to the National Treasury, and the National Treasuries are not interested in, first of all, hypothecation and using that particularly for environmental issues. They're just, and secondly, they don't necessarily want that much transparency about how, once you've raised some taxes, how that money is spent. So that might get people on side for green moves, green measures, if there was more transparency inside a country, if a green tax is launched. Internationally, I think, you know, I mean, thank you very much, and I'd urge everyone in the audience to read your Climate and Freedom Accord and your outline proposal for a free market climate agreement. But you've got to understand perceptions to words. So for lots of people in the world, free markets does not mean what we think it is, open markets and equal access to markets. People might associate it with big business. And you've got to make sure it's seen to be that local people and local businesses can also benefit from this approach. It can't be the big American companies or the big European companies or the big multinationals who, even though they may be the best people to do this sometimes, you've also got to make sure that it's not in favour of big companies over small companies or over local people. Because otherwise, local voters will be very concerned about their economy being taken over by foreign firms. Now, we get used to that in many countries. You know, it's not, in the UK, we've got lots of foreign firms. Our biggest car manufacturers are owned by the Japanese, for example, and issues like that. But other countries, if you're trying to get them to sign up to some of this stuff, you've got to be aware that you've got to hold their hand and be with them. I would also be very careful, and you and I have had this discussion about using the word, you know, freedom and free markets. You know, I mean, I love those phrases, but actually, it's interpreted in the perception. Don't forget, you know, many of the Trumpians in America talk about freedom. And also, you know, free markets sometimes is mischaracterized as being big business. So I think a better way would be to build a wider coalition. A way would be to talk about things that many countries can agree on. So, for example, do market mechanisms, and you can show examples of where market mechanisms lead to better outcomes. You can show where more prosperous economies are able to cut their emissions better. You can show how involving more private capital and more non-state and more competition could lead to a reduction in emissions. That would be a much better way, but also in order to get countries signed up to this accord, you've got to build international coalitions. So you've got to find language that appeals to the negotiators in those countries, but also appeals to the politicians of those countries. So I'll give you one quick example. I mean, I love what you're saying about private ownership of land and deforestation, but what happens if you sell that land privately, but you've got no conditions on the use of that land? So you might be saying, well, we're selling that land for deforestation. Sorry, it's deforested, and we will incentivize people to plant trees and to make it a greener space. But you've got to make sure that down the road, that someone doesn't come and build a big housing estate there or luxury apartments. So what you've got to do is show that this is environmentally led, and all the arguments you make about markets and freer economies work. But also the other point but there's also another point where you could possibly talk when sometimes countries complain they want more help from outside, but they've actually got state monopolies. And the thing you talk about in terms of competition would be very interesting if there are new competitors who can offer the same services that the state monopoly is supposed to offer, but they can offer it at lower carbon emissions. And so that's the way I think you have to build a coalition to get more people on side for this agreement. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lord Kamal. I will mention that this proposal, a version of it, was taken up by a Swiss negotiator named Henrique Schneider and turned into an amendment for Article 6.8 of the Paris Agreement. And it's on the table now that any country could pick it up and move it forward. But Henry is actually the chief economist of the Swiss Federation of Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises. And he specifically, to your point about, free markets are promoting for big business, he's particularly interested in the interests of small businesses. And he understands that this would actually provide a great deal, the basic framework would be very good for small businesses and for, tax-exempt savings accounts could be used by anyone. Tax-exempt loans could be microloans for small entrepreneurs. So it is an inclusive framework. And on to your other point about, countries that don't, have monopoly markets. I heard a panel at a very fancy organization the other day on the Global South, and there was two ministers, one from an African country and one from a Latin American country, both talking about, the importance of market access and how they needed financing, to help build out, energy access. Well, both of those countries have state-owned, monopolies in both, energy and electricity and power. And, you're not going to be able to provide energy access very quickly through a monopoly framework. You need a competitive market to really actually build that out quickly. The competitive market will do that job much faster. So, I was wondering if they had any awareness of that. But in any event, I will say that we do have with us now 3 members of the Australian delegation, the Right Honourable Kevin Hogan, Senators Dean Smith, and Senators Andrew Bragg. I don't know, you're a little late. I don't know if you got a chance to read any of that information that I sent to you guys about the Climate and Freedom Accord and the subject of the discussion today. But I hope you have. But in any event, we're talking about free market international climate agreements, what they should contain, what should be on the agenda. So would...
Rod,
yes.
I'm very happy to vacate the seat if one of the Australian politicians wants to come here and give their perspective.
Well, they could do that, or they could take the podium, give us...
Okay.
Which would you prefer to do? Come to the dais or come to the podium?
I'm happy to make a brief comment there, just to add to it. I know
Sure. The Right Honourable Kevin Hogan.
look, thanks, Rod, and good to see you again. We met very briefly in Glasgow, so thank you for the opportunity. So I'll be brief, and I apologise that I haven't obviously been part of the initial conversation, so whether I'm repeating what's been said or not. But look, in what I do, I'm now Shadow Trade and Tourism Minister, so obviously have a lot of very vested interest in trade. And I'd just like to make the comment, the observation, and would love the panel's feedback. So my understanding is that global trade over the last 20 years has gone something like from $6 trillion US a year to over $30 trillion US a year. And over that same period, we've had global poverty as a percentage of the global population go from something like 30% of the globe's population to 10. Now, I would argue that they are intrinsically linked. Now, we know, and I caught on just the end of a couple of things that you just said, the more wealthy people become and the more wealthy a country becomes, the more environmentally conscious they become, and labour laws improve over time as well. So I share some concerns when we look at things like, and to name one, CBAMs, okay, that if we were, so I'm prefacing this by basically saying that I believe that trade, global trade, is a golden goose that lays golden eggs. So if I see something that I think is going to upset that or inhibit that, even though the intention may be noble, we're killing the goose that's laying the golden egg. So if we were to talk about things like CBAMs to start this, to my initial contribution, be very interested in people's observation on that, because I would argue that if we're going to do that unilaterally, and we've seen comments from a lot of ministers in Europe as well, I think that would be exceptionally damaging. That's a tariff effectively, unless it's a very multilateral process. But that's a contribution that I'd just like to make. Rod, I'm very happy for the...
I think you are right on target, Mr. Hogan. I think that it, not only is free trade a goose that lays golden eggs, free trade is basically decarbonizing. Free trade drives it makes the cost lower for clean technologies. It enables innovation to spread. There are a few groups in the United States that favor federal funding for innovation, and they argue, we're going to, drive innovation and then we'll sell the innovation around the world. Well, you're not going to sell the innovation around the world if you've created trade wars and trade barriers to that. But, with your intervention in mind, I'd like to turn to Michael Mealing, and ask you, because you had a very good point about how free trade drove the solar industry. Can you tell us about that, Michael?
Sure. I'm Mike. And I'll echo, I think, a lot of concerns and thoughts that have already been mentioned by other speakers and by yourself, Rod. First of all, I applaud the initiative to try to introduce a new way of thinking and approach in this forum. I think it faces steep challenges to get multilateral sign-up, as we all know. Consensus around even less difficult and complex issues has been very hard to secure in this particular setting. To need the microphone closer, thanks, Henry. But I still think it's important and timely, and I think it's particularly important and timely because of where we find ourselves this year more than in previous years, where you had already been bringing up these ideas. So, as difficult as it may be in this era of fragmenting sort of multilateralism to try and get cooperation around issues, whether we like it or not, many of the challenges that we're facing, whether we cooperate or not, we're facing them together. And so climate is one example, but I think around the world, fiscal pressures, rising debt levels, now inflationary pressures that you described, leading to higher interest rates, a higher cost burden, etc. That in turn exacerbating competitive pressures. This is something that all countries face. And I think the initiatives that you here propose can help address those. Unfortunately, the responses we see, whether it's the CBAM in Europe, whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, they're shaped by industrial policy, they're shaped by national security concerns, they're shaped by geopolitical rivalries, and those motivations spill over into the design of the policies and the unintended effects that several of you have already mentioned. So whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act, which purportedly supports and lowers barriers, you'd think, to clean technology, but it comes laced with these localization requirements, local content requirements, conditions for market access that precisely create barriers and create costs for the scaling up of manufacturing of clean technologies compared to where we were a few years ago. The CBAM, I don't think I have to add anything to what Senator Farid already said. And of course, you can look at it economically, but I'll pick up maybe where Lord Kamal was coming from, looking at the politics of it all. You just have to look at the discussions here at COP28. It's astonishing that CBAM, which was already in the books, did not bubble up more at COP27, but here definitely it is on the agenda. Basic countries, so Brazil, South Africa, India, China, wanted it to be an agenda item. They were convinced not to force that, but it's still in the global stocktake discussion. It's in the response measures contact group. It is an issue that's creating concern. It's an issue that threatens to undermine the very fragile sort of bargain between developed and developing countries around working together on climate. I think we cannot afford another sort of burden on this already so hard-fought, forum and tentative cooperation to deal with the global climate problem. But the second thing is economics, and that's where I bring in what you mentioned on PV. I just want to remind us, if you look back on the IPCC's Working Group 3 report of the 6th assessment report that came out last year, and they tried to sort of rank what our mitigation options are to deal with the climate challenge. And they look at everything, CCS, land use, change land use practices, EVs, etc. The single most important mitigation option we have in the next decade is solar PV, because it has become available at scale, at competitive price, and it can be deployed all over the world. And how did we get there? Well, if you look at sort of the story of innovation and scaling up of solar PV, it's one of open borders, an idea that was born in labs in France in the previous century, then spills over to California. Bell Labs sort of starts showing pilot projects and practical applications. Japanese manufacturers decide they start actually producing it for niche things like space, outer space or off-grid solutions. Then Europe decides to strongly support renewable energy, which creates the bud of a new industry in Germany. And of course, like so many things with free trades and open borders, you see some of that, of course, wander off to where countries have competitive advantages to scale that up further and manufacture it at lower cost. And it ends up mostly in China. One may not like the fact that Europe lost a lot of industry, a very innovative industry to China. And there are problems that have to be addressed, no question. China got there also by intervening in markets with industrial policy, with heavy subsidization, and that's not okay, it's not fair. But the policies that we are now deploying, the retrenchment and the fragmentation of the global economy, that we are sort of taking as a price to recalibrate the international economic order, I fear would potentially prevent the exact kind of spillovers that we saw in technologies like solar photovoltaic, and we see it already with electric vehicles, with batteries. Europe is trying to get barriers to Chinese electric vehicles. The US is making imports of certain low-cost batteries and materials and so on, conditioned on certain restrictions. So again, I think it's very important to bring in these ideas at a time where everybody's talking about erecting barriers, to remind us not to throw out the baby with the bathwater and sort of forget the benefits of free trade, the benefits of competition and of open borders. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. It's an important reminder. We don't want to kill free trade, by using these mechanisms, because the trade itself is decarbonizing, right? So you want to make sure you preserve free trade robustly and not interfere with it too much. You had a quick comment.
Just in 5 seconds comment, two things. First of all, in Egypt, we used to rely heavily on fuel subsidies. In 2014, we started to cut down the fuel subsidies. And guess what happened? What happened is the growth of the consumption of fuel had reduced. If you look at the period from 2010 to 2014, you'll get about 20%, something like that, the increase in the consumption. It was reduced to about 15% from 2014 to 2022, something like that. Given that, in Egypt, we are ever growing. Every second we grow, more people being born, more cars being purchased. But again, this shows you the market works, that when you put things on its right price and let the price mechanism works, you will get fuel efficiency. Just imagine what would be the possibility if you add more incentives in that field. So this is one. The other thing, the quote of Milton Friedman, that it's one of the greatest mistakes ever to judge policies and progress by its intentions, not by its results. And I believe now when we're talking about the CBAM and such policies, we are judging by the by the intentions, not by the results. And I'm afraid that at the time when we look at the results, it would be a hefty price to pay in that matter. Thank you very much.
Yes. So any other comments to the Right Honorable Kevin Hogan's point? I would say take a look at the Climate and Freedom Accord proposal, because it is an alternative to the CBAM that is, positive incentive-based rather than, punishment-based. So with that, moving from Australia to Europe, I'd like to go to, I'm going to butcher your name.
Oldrich Vlasak, it's difficult.
Vlasak? Yes, who is an old friend, by the way, of Lord Kamal's from the European Parliament, I believe. But please, let us know your thoughts on this important question of, what is the need for a free market climate agreement and what should it look like?
Yeah, thank you very much for the word. First, I would like to say that I'm not expert on that issue. And we prepare with my team some remarks, which is good to present it, to understand EU policy at all. Let me first introduce also my institution I'm representing here today, the European Committee of the Regions, which represents more than 1 million elected politicians from all regions and cities in Europe. We are the only region in the world where the subnational levels of governance are organized in an institutional way. Our role is to contribute to the EU lawmaking process on new proposals and then have an impact on regions and cities. 70% of all EU legislation. Regions and cities play a key role in catalyzing the green transition, the need for which has been accentuated by the COVID-19 pandemic and ongoing war in Ukraine, at least in Europe. However, subnational governments' budgets are insufficient in their own to finance and fund the scale of climate action needed to transition to a carbon-neutral economy by 2050. There is therefore a crucial need to support subnational governments in mobilizing public and private finance. Let me first signal that the EU and its policies are nothing but result of the agreement of 27 different countries, and there are some subsidies can be managed at EU level. The tax policies remain at the hand of the 27 member states. This fact helps understand the complexity of the position of Europe when addressing the tools available to reach the goal of climate neutrality. The EU official delegation is negotiating with the parties to the UNFCCC on the basis of a mandate given to the Council of the EU. The Council is a meeting of the 27 environmental ministers. And we are very happy because this year the mandate includes the recognition of the leadership of local and regional governments in accelerating and broadening climate action. Trade facilitation is also a way to improve the common efforts to decarbonize the economy, and I would like to remind that the EU is the world's largest exporter of manufactured goods and services and is itself the biggest export marker for around 80 countries. Together, the European Union members account for 16% of world imports and exports. The development of trade, if properly managed, is an opportunity for economic growth. So EU trade policy seeks to create growth and jobs by increasing the opportunities for trade and investment with the rest of the world. Mobilizing private sources of financing will be crucial. Local and regional authorities will need an enhanced administrative capacity in order to overcome a weak engineering capacity due to their size and available resources. We agree that private investors should be given incentives in order to materialize the cooperation with the more dynamic subnational governments. Incentives and subsidies need to be deployed in an efficient way, allowing cities to be able to absorb and manage properly, and this requires skilled staff duly trained. to me, this is a key point. Education, training, upskilling to be able to apply the policies. Thank you very much for attention.
Thank you very much for that. I would like to move to Andrew Bragg, Senator from Australia.
Thanks,
Please,
Rod.
you have the floor.
Thanks very much. It is nice to see you all. I'm running an inquiry in the Australian Senate which is looking at the electrification of our households. And we've had a number of people who have suggested to us that we should look to replicate the US approach here with the Inflation Reduction Act. And like any economic policy judgment, we need to look at the best way to electrify our houses. Now, we have a lot of fossil fuels in our homes in Australia. There is a high penetration of gas in terms of the cooking and also the heating and also of heating of water. And so we are looking at what is going to be the best way for us to do this, which doesn't generate a huge support base for crony capitalists and that is regulatory neutral. And I'm very open to any suggestions people might have. But I have to say, in looking at your work, Rod, I'm very attracted to trying to find a way that is going to ensure that we can find a way to meet our other objective as a centre-right party, which is to reduce the overall tax burden without distorting the market. So we have received over 200 submissions, and at this stage I'm very attracted to the idea that we would be cutting personal income taxes for individuals, Australians, that choose to decarbonise their houses. And the best way I've heard this explained is actually by an Australian who's had a lot to do with the IRA, whose name is Saul Griffith, who a lot of people on our side of politics have not been attracted to, but I think that Griffith has a lot of good messages for people on the centre-right as well. And so we're looking at whether we could institute a uniform tax reduction for personal income tax purposes. But of course, a lot of this work needs to take into account that if you want to decarbonise buildings, these are often owned by companies, property developers, landlords. So we'd also need to look at how we could reduce their tax burden. And again, this is talking about the income tax burden that companies face. So that is our instinct about how we could go forward with a policy in this area, which would meet the twin objectives of promoting enterprise, reducing the tax burden, but also achieving decarbonisation of our houses. And as you know, if we're able to achieve the decarbonisation of our houses and our businesses, then we are a long way along the pathway of getting to net zero, which has been, in our country, a very contested debate, as it has in many other countries. So that's where we're at the moment.
Well, I would say, in terms of response to that, that in competitive markets, you see, the build out of the transmission network much faster, and you see, the ability of people to enter the market to respond to the consumer needs faster. So you'll see more decarbonization. Electrification itself may not be decarbonizing if the sources of your electricity are coal, for instance. So you need that competition in there to actually change the energy mix. But I'd be happy to talk to you further about, ways to start, structuring incentives to decarbonize. With that, let us go to our Sanjeev Nair. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Yes. Our partner from Cuts International. Please let us know your thoughts, Mr. Nair.
Thank you, Rod. I would be bringing in a perspective from the global south as well as from the consumer movement on the subject. And based on my experience in Africa for the last 20, 25 years. Mm-hmm. And I also have experience when we talk about automotive industry. I have, out of my 30 years, about 15 years, I was in the power generation sector, especially fossil fuel powered the power, standby power generators as well as automotive. So when you talk about that, it comes to my mind how those things are actually related to the emission which we are talking about. From the perspective of, you mentioned about a couple of areas where competition, and free trade, which in our region we call it mostly fair trade. And the other area which I would like to talk about is climate finance, which we are having a campaign on that, because the COP28 is all about, from the southern perspective, is about climate finance. And from the perspective of competition, which you mentioned, CUTS, being an organization, we are celebrating our 40 years this time, and we have worked about 30 countries in promoting fair competition, working with competition authorities, and we believe that competition which you are talking about really benefit consumers. That in order to have that efficient market, as well as benefit for the consumers, you need competition. But in the southern hemisphere, we call it fair trade, linked to. It is not free trade, actually. Even when you look at the authorities in many of the countries, we call it fair trading authority, or a consumer competition and consumer protection authority. That means you have that element of regulation inbuilt into the system. And I think that is that's a difference which we see in terms of whether it is Zambia, whether it is South Africa, all other countries in the region. We have that element of competition, but with the regulation inbuilt, and it's fair trade, not free trade as such. It is not, and that is based on the premise that many of the countries in the south, free trade alone may not help the market because we haven't grown up to a particular level. The second aspect, which is about when we talk about free trade, and we listen to the WTO DG pitching for WTO's role in, or global trade bodies' role in terms of this climate change negotiation. We're talking about, you mentioned about SMEs, and we cannot ignore that fact that our WTO system has been, in a limbo for a couple of years for so many reasons. And in the initial stages of WTO, most of the countries in the south, they were not keen to have the climate change or environmental aspect to be included under the trade. But now that opposition has gone. But then what we see is that WTO is not working the way it is expected to be. So when we talk about free trade, we cannot de-link the role that WTO plays in promoting that free trade, especially from the perspective of southern countries, from the south. The third aspect is about climate finance. I think that's the area where we have a lot of synergies. We believe that, like this present system of climate financing, which is not working, and you need a different architecture. That is the advocacy which we are promoting, in the sense that it is the approach which we are talking about, cooperative approach, where we believe that an institution that can be neutral in terms of, where it can bring in players, it can bring in public resources. At present, most of the climate finance we are talking about is public resources being transferred from the north to the south. And that's the arrangement. Paris Agreement, if you talk about mostly, that's where. And what we believe is that is not sustainable, and we need to have a mechanism where we have the private sector, where we talk about taxes, taxes elements, and we also heard about the COP. We are talking about philanthropy, where the King Charles talked about bringing those big charities into the picture, and we believe that having that institutional setup neutral from the present one, because most of the developing countries, they don't want World Bank to be the managing any of the resources, whether it is adaptation fund, whether it is loss and damage, and that arrangement can bring in much more sanity into the financing system that will decarbonize our climate space. I think these are some of the thoughts. And in terms of synergies, we also believe that, consumer movement, when you talk about energy efficient, there's a lot of challenge, because I'm just coming from the Consumers International Global Conference, taking place every 4 years. We had 49 countries being represented there. We had the ISO chief making presentation. The key challenge is that how do consumers compare green products when we talk about? We don't have the standards. And unless we have that standards and labeling, how do we say that, this is better than the other, that choice? And that is very important for the free market economy to operate, where consumers have that choice and they need to have that information, which is not. The second aspect which we discussed there is about the greenwashing, and that, where a lot of money in the name of climate finance is given for companies, institutions. We are not really contributing to the decarbonization, but
Right.
they are. I think these are some of the aspects which we thought would help the discussion from the consumer perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those remarks. I appreciate your concerns about free trade versus fair trade. I would even say myself that I have great concerns about, free trade with authoritarian imperialist countries that, use trade in a way to fund the invasion of other countries, for instance. So I think that there are, perhaps limits on how far you can push free trade. I do have concerns about, fair trade sometimes being a cover for protectionism and politically driven, interventions in the market that aren't necessarily fair but are labeled fair by politicians. So there's concerns that you have to look at on all sides in terms of that. But if we could bounce back to Australia, and Senator Dean Smith, it's very good to see you again. I enjoyed our conversations in Glasgow, and I'm very interested to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much, Rod, and congratulations to the Grace Richardson Fund for all the important work that you do. Being a parliamentarian prohibits me from being an expert on anything, so I thought I would just make some overarching comments. The first is that discussions about markets, discussions about consumers and the important role that they play, our concern for authoritarian regimes and the influence that they bring to the world has never been more pronounced. So we are operating in a very unique and unfortunate set of circumstances which make the cause of freedom, the cause of democracy, very, very paramount in our consideration. Walking around COP this time, and I met Rod in Glasgow just 2 years ago, it is interesting to see the number of young people, and it's particularly interesting to see where young people are choosing to congregate. And I think we need to remind ourselves that it's young people who will be the greatest beneficiaries of policies that promote freedom, policies that are built on the market, and in this inflationary global environment, public money, which is poorly disciplined, will never serve our outcomes as successful as private money. And I think we're presented with a unique set of challenges, but we're also presented with a unique set of opportunities that make the causes that we think are so central to our success as a humanity so important and so paramount at this particular point in time. As I like to say in Western Australia, a short contribution from a senator is always received better than a long contribution. But can I just end by congratulating you on the important work you do, because I think that the causes that we hold dear to ourselves, causes and ideas and laws that we know have been proven to be highly successful in removing poverty from our world, increasing living standards, holding governments accountable, have never been so more important than they are at the moment. So congratulations to you and to all the panel members, and we look forward to seeing you next year.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Smith. If everyone actually figures out where the COP is going to be next year, which is not quite decided yet, but I would say all of those tried and true ideas that produce prosperity also produce decarbonization. And it's very important to keep that in mind, that the fundamental freedoms are what do it, and the cronyism is perhaps what drives the worst of climate change, really. So, in any event, to move next, I'd like to go to Dr. Would you like to make the introduction, Hallie? You seemed eager to do so, so please do.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Our final speaker is Dr. Vaibhav Chaturvedi. Yes? Okay, from the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water, and I'll be back for concluding remarks after his remarks. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Very good afternoon to all. Very happy to be here, and I look forward to reading the report. A disclaimer, I am also an economist on the right, so I am definitely biased towards the idea of free markets. So I am looking forward to it and learning from it. I'm not a trade economist, so I'll probably talk more about what is this trade versus climate debate is doing and how it is progressing and what are the implications of it. I think the first big point is the bedrock of this whole free markets debate is essentially trust and cooperation. That has to be the bedrock, right? And some more interesting information, the IPCC scenarios, right, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it has also got a bunch of different kinds of scenario sets and all. One set is about this kind of scenario where you have like very good trust and cooperation among different countries and how does the world move forward in that kind of scenario process. The second, and they've got a bunch of scenarios, but the second big element is what if countries kind of don't trust each other? There are trade wars, there are unilateral actions, and what happens in that kind of scenario? The result is very, very clear. I think the result, what they say, is that, well, in a world where trust and cooperation is the core principle, then climate actions are much more accelerated. And it's kind of a good world to be in as compared to the other scenario, which is definitely not a good scenario. So that's why this notion of free markets and kind of trust and all is kind of very important. It's very clear the pathway that we are following now. Interestingly, 5 years back, I think in the IPCC community also, we thought that the default scenario that we are moving towards is the trust and cooperation kind of scenario. That does not necessarily mean free markets, the kind of we are talking about, but it's still much more closer to that in whatever is possible in reality, right? Now, I think the debate is definitely moving that we are probably not in that pathway anymore. We're moving towards a pathway where it's much more trade wars, much more countries that are kind of trying to, in the geopolitics, showing that they're very powerful. So many, many different kinds of actions. So very different scenario pathway on which we are already moving. That is, we are increasingly kind of feeling this way. And so what happens when this kind of future is going ahead is a very different, very bad from the climate perspective. Now, coming back to this larger question of the free markets, a very interesting observation that happened during that IPCC summary for policymakers report. Very interesting. So all the scenarios are free market kind of like trade and cooperation, that kind of scenario. So the big question that was asked and why the report was kind of stuck for so long, the debate was stuck for so long, was that the big question was these are scenarios that reflect efficiency, which is like the trade consideration, efficiency and those kinds of consideration. They don't consider equity. And that was a big kind of stumbling block. And that is the debate, even in the negotiation process, we are increasingly hearing. And that is what any new framing, including this free market framing, will have to kind of face and take on. That what does this mean for equity consideration? Because that is becoming, especially from the developing South perspective, that has become the most important element. And that's why in the next round of analysis that we are expected to kind of do, this whole point is coming that now all the new scenario sets that we should be imagining has to have this core principle of equity being reflected in it. Now, what that means, of course, we are also evaluating and trying to better understand, but that is the one big thing that is kind of happening. Market as a principle is accepted. We have Article 6. We have already some operationalization of Article 6.2 is happening. So market as a principle is kind of accepted at this level also, I think UNFCCC level also. But I think what we are talking about is a much more radical kind of interpretation of that market paradigm that we are probably talking about this, right? It's not that people are anti-market in the system, but we are probably talking about something very else, very different. In fact, I was also delayed for this discussion because prior to that, I was in a discussion with Pascal Lamy, who is the former DG of WTO, and that was on CBAM. And that was on CBAM. So that is also another similar discussion. The big point is that many of these unilateral measures are definitely eroding trust in the larger climate debate, which is very dangerous, as also already mentioned. It is dangerous because trust is eroding. This is only one of those things that is eroding trust. There are many, many other things that are happening, but trust needs to be kind of restored in the larger system, right? And in terms of, let's say, this, the final point I want to make in interest of time, the climate debate has moved from this kind of a globally shaped debate to a more nationally determined debate, right? And that's a very important element now. All the measures, all the kind of targets and everything has to be nationally determined. And that is why CBAM is opposed in such a big way by the Global South, but kind of, there's a tussle with the nationally determined nature of the climate debate now. Because CBAM is kind of levying a tax which some other jurisdiction is deciding. And it is not, there's no nationally determined, nothing nationally determined about CBAM at all, right? So any new paradigm has to kind of answer that. So two big questions, equity. Second is, what does it do to the nationally determined nature within the climate discourse? So I look forward to reading the report and better understanding how does it answer these two big considerations. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chakravarti, very much. So what can you all do if you're interested in this? The Climate and Freedom Accord is actually an amendment, before the UNFCCC Secretariat. If you know any ministries of any nations, any party can raise their hands and say, we want to study this further, we want to move it forward. So if you if any people in this room with Blue Zone access have interest, contacts with any ministries, you can make action and move things forward yourselves just by doing so. I want to thank our panel. I want to thank the UAE for hosting COP23. Hallie, I'd like to thank our senators from Australia and Lord Kamal, Senator Farid, Michael Mealing, Sajeev Nair, Oleg Valsek, and Dr. Chakravarti for coming. Hallie, do you want to take us out?
Yes, thank you again. We'll be writing up some brief remarks from this event and the other one we held yesterday. Please visit the GraceRichardsonFund.org for a summary and perhaps some photos. And if anyone has any thoughts, we'd certainly be welcome for that. And any officially prepared remarks, we'd like to include them in a report. And again, please feel free to reach out to us. The International Coalition is participatory, but you do need to register per event. So we look forward to staying in contact with all of you. Thanks very much. We appreciate the time. Thank you to our staff here and for everyone coming to make this event so excellent. Have a good day, everyone.